I'm Dr. Robert Perkins, and this is Courtroom Homeostasis, where today we're going to be talking with people who are experienced in working in the courtroom environment and identifying and addressing the stress and trauma that was accrued while working in that particular environment. And with me today is Dr. Wendy Patrick.
My name is Wendy Patrick, and I have spent my career working in a courtroom and have had the opportunity not only to amass plenty of experiences in how different types of people deal with stress and trauma, but also to meet many important people that really make the process run smoothly. And we are blessed to have one of those people with us today, introducing Detective Rachel Frost. Thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Could you describe what your role was in your position working actually in the courtroom? And did you find that particularly challenging?
Certainly. I was law enforcement for 20 years. I became a detective about 5 years in, not quite 5 years. Prior to that, obviously being a deputy. But as an investigator, I was a master investigator, so our top step detective position. I focused primarily starting our department's domestic violence threat assessment unit, well, threat management unit. And in that role, I did a lot of expert witness testimony, encouraged and tried to mentor many other detectives to become expert witnesses, to become experts in domestic violence and threat assessment and stalking, et cetera. In terms of the courtroom, beyond the expert witness component, obviously I was there for cases. I was there for training. I did training for judges, training for prosecutors and defense attorneys, et cetera. And in terms of trauma, certainly with the cases, not so much I would say my original expert witness testimony. When I did expert witness for criminal, I usually did it blind. So I would like to go in and do testimony just on the basics of domestic violence, the basics of stalking, et cetera. But now in my own firm, as I'm doing expert witness, it's a different component. Now I delve deep into the cases and have intimate, relationship in terms of the trauma that everybody suffered. And for certain, when I was doing criminal cases, I experienced that as well.
When we talk about the different types of cases you've been involved with, were there certain types of cases over the years where you found it more difficult to listen to that courtroom testimony, and why?
Oh, without a doubt. And I think a majority of people would probably say very similar to what my experience was. Child abuse and elder abuse cases to me were specifically difficult to listen to, mostly because not that other abuse victims, apparently, had some sort of ability to protect themselves. I feel that all abuse victims, are there because they've been victimized, and it's not that one crime is worse than the others. But with the children with elder, I felt that there was a lot of opportunity there where we had victims that were being unheard. We had victims that perhaps suffered for a very long time before this information came forward, if it even did before the person had been murdered. And so for me specifically, especially as an investigator, I was constantly thinking about, who do we not know about yet? Who are we missing right now? Who's going through this? Not so much even the trauma of the circumstance I was in at that moment, because at least we had something we could do, something tangible, something we could focus on, which was the case itself. But for the people and for the children and the elders who were out there being abused and being traumatized by people that we weren't aware of yet.
And going through those cases, as you've described, how did you personally manage to cope with the exposure to all of that traumatic evidence? And did it get easier or harder over time?
I thought about this question. You're kind enough to ask me that earlier. And I thought about that deeply because I do believe, especially as a police officer, and there's a phrase that we tend to use in our program we're working on for trauma. And it's, we never let you see us sweat. We don't talk about our trauma the way that we should. We don't deal with our trauma the way that we should. It's not normalized in our environment, in the law enforcement environment, even in the courtroom environment, as much as it should be. And so I think at first it was the same to deal with along the way, because we didn't deal with it right then. We dealt with it later. You pack it up and it stacks up. So I think that as time went on, there was more of it stacked up. It wasn't so much that it got easier. I think that you got used to it because you'd seen it. And so you're like, oh, this is like this happened, or this is like when that happened. But you stack it up. And so I think that it doesn't necessarily become easier. There's more of it. You tamp it down more. But for me, you know, I have good friends in law enforcement. We're able to talk about different things. I think being female in law enforcement is beneficial because we're more vocal. We're more willing to sit down with a friend and, you know, grab a martini or a snack or something, and not have extreme negative coping mechanisms where I might say, I might cope with a martini at the end of the day. I'm not coping with 20. You know, I'm not coping with all the other negative coping mechanisms that we have. I think that a lot of law enforcement has, that a lot of people go through trauma because they don't know what to do with all that stacked up stuff, you know, so they have to do something to take their mind off of all of this. Whereas I think, you know, I've been very blessed to have people that I know who I can have those conversations with. It doesn't mean that certain things aren't more difficult to deal with than others. You know, I think anybody who's gone through the trauma of the reality of our existence, you know, I think a lot of people think they know the reality of what happens in court and what happens on TV and what happens in crimes, but the actual reality is extremely traumatic. And those who don't recognize and absorb the fact that it's okay not to be okay about this, like this is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Nobody should see dead children like this, or ever. You know, nobody should see someone who's been abused, or an elder person who's the victim of a strangulation homicide, or, you know, no one should actually have to visually, physically, in any sensory way witness any of that. And if you don't feel okay afterwards, that's okay. That's how you're supposed to feel. And it's when we don't, because we're tamping it so far down, that's when we really need to be concerned. But I've been blessed to have people I can talk about with that.
Well, that's such a very good point, Rachel. You have an understanding of the fact that, you know, human beings, the police officers are human beings. They're not less prone to emotional outbursts. They're not less prone to the sight of blood. But one of the things that as police officers we've been able to do is we've conditioned ourselves to be able to sort of press the pause button on both emotional, psychological, and sometimes physiological reactions to some extremely traumatic situations. But there comes a time to pay the piper. That pause button has to come off. And, you know, for those that operate with the pause button on, we're postponing the inevitable. There is a debt that's incurred when anyone is exposed to stress and trauma, and that debt has to be paid. And the longer that we wait to pay that debt, the more interest that's accruing, and the more time and resources that are going to be needed in order to process that. So that's a very good point. But I did want to ask you a question. So I was a frontline law enforcement officer for 14 years of my life. And, you know, one of the things that was great about that job was not being confined in an office, was being in a car. And essentially, the radio was my boss. Now, when you went from being in frontline policing to now working in a courtroom environment, did you find that transition stressful?
I didn't find the transition stressful. I loved being a cop, without a doubt. I mean, there was no other job like it. I was very blessed to almost be able to have my own schedule a lot, because I worked on programs and I could be at this station or that station. It takes about 4 hours or so, I think, to drive across our county. So I had a lot of varied opportunity to do different things, to do, you know, sometimes we did undercover stuff, very rarely for me, but sometimes, you know, and then other, you know, and got to have a very congenial environment where I was working with other people. For me, I got to a point in my job where I just wasn't loving it as much, because I wasn't doing cop stuff and I wasn't doing my domestic violence. I wasn't doing all the things that gave me passion. I wanted to be able to help people. I'd been transferred to the academy, and not that it was a bad thing, it just was, and I wasn't teaching. I think if I'd been transferred there and I was teaching, I'd been able to sink my teeth into something where I felt like I was doing some good, but I was kind of, you know, moving this paper to this desk and that paper to that desk. And you know, I was also getting the Narcan out to everybody, which was valuable, granted, but it just wasn't, if you will, the jam in my jelly roll. And I missed what gave me passion. I think there's lots of people who could go from 8 to 5, making a nice, decent paycheck and do that and just be grateful for the break. That just wasn't me. I needed to do something that mattered. And so for me, it actually hasn't been a stressful transition other than there's a lot of your identity tied up most times with someone who's been in law enforcement for 20 years with being a cop. That's been an extremely difficult transition for me, to not be a peace officer anymore, to not to, and I think that people who haven't been police officers might think that I'm saying, I mean, I don't have that authority over others, or I don't mean that at all. I mean that, you know, sinking your teeth into a case where you're like, okay, how can I find out the truth of this? And how can I help this person, you know, and how can I help this situation? How can I make this better? And I'll be honest, there's that feeling for that dare to be great situation, you know, that moment of I'm going out today. I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 12 hours. And it could be the most boring 12 hours of my life. It could be the most interesting 12 hours of my life. I've been fortunate in my transition that I've gotten to work on some cases that are civil in nature, but really are criminal cases that have never been brought to the criminal arena. But here we are trying them in the court of public opinion, and here we are trying them in a civil courtroom. And so I've found my niche, which is really evidence-based information. I'm not here to make conjecture about this fits this pattern or this fits this. I dive into cases looking for evidence and saying, how can I corroborate? How can I refute? And I'm all about the truth. I've had some people say, there's an organization, I will remain nameless, who said, oh, well, you can't join our organization if you testify for the defense. And I said, well, I disagree with that, because your testimony should be the same no matter who you're testifying for. The truth is the truth, and it doesn't change if you're testifying for the prosecution. It doesn't change if you're testifying for the defense or the plaintiff or the respondent or whatever. So I think the stress was more in making the decision to go and then in adjusting to the decision. Being in the courtroom to me is home. So I feel very comfortable in the courtroom. I don't get flustered on the stand. I mean, I'm sure there's times when I'm like, oh, dang, I didn't think of that. You know, and that's a good question. But I outright say, well, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a minute. I'm on the stand right now like I am right here. So, so far that's been not so much trauma and stress as an adjustment.
It was very well put. To others, perhaps, that come from a similar background that now find themselves working in the courtroom, what advice would you give them to managing the sort of stress and trauma that they're going to be exposed to working in a courtroom environment?
Well, I definitely say you have to recognize that it's there. It's coming. It's not, and again, it kind of is like that going out on patrol, if you will. You don't know what's going to show up in your courtroom that day, because even if you have the most mundane cases planned, if you're in a criminal courtroom, you don't know what's walking through that door that day. Everyone in here has seen different things that have occurred in different courtrooms across the United States, across the world, where, you know, somebody walks in with a gun, somebody walks in with this. You have to acknowledge what your concerns and your fears are in advance. It's just like when I teach self-defense classes. Think about what might happen before it happens, and then it won't be as jarring if and when it does. And then once that you are exposed to trauma, accept it, embrace it. Know that I hate to keep reminding it, but I always say, when I teach, I talk about, we need to take the drama out of trauma. You know, when I say it's okay not to be okay, because, right, we talk a good game, I think, in the justice community and in the courtrooms and, you know, across the United States and across the world, really. We talk a good game about wanting to address trauma. But then we assign that dramatic person, or that person can't handle it, or that person's too this or too that, when they're the one that says, hey, not for nothing, but that screwed me up. I don't feel so great about that. And I can't go in there and talk about that case again. For example, I was listening to a nutritionist the other day who used to be a police officer, and she suddenly started talking about how Sandy Hook affected her. She's nowhere near Sandy Hook. She lives in California, works in one of the beach cities. But she said, just hearing about Sandy Hook and having those visual images and seeing everything on television brought up every child I had ever seen, every case I'd ever worked with abuse and trauma to a child. And all of a sudden, it came down on the back of my head like an anvil on my heart. And it was something like that that triggered it, because we hadn't really unpacked like a lot of that stuff beforehand. So I think it's really recognizing that and understanding that, hey, it's coming, and it's okay to have that support and look for those ways to support yourself in advance.
Sandy Hook is a very good example, as was the Vegas shooting. You know, we talk about what you're describing really is what we know is vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma carries exactly the same physiological, emotional, and psychological signals of distress and symptoms as if someone was exposed to the trauma themselves. But generally, you know, people that are suffering from vicarious trauma are people that have very high levels of empathy, are in the business of helping others, specifically those who deal with victims. And interestingly enough, the number one demographic of people that they're tied with social workers that suffer the most from vicarious trauma happens to be family court judges. So that's a very good point. Very good point that you bring up.
It's funny that you say that, because in my trainings, I talk about when I train advocates, because I'll train advocates talking about strangulation so they recognize different things. And when I talk about vicarious trauma, I say, I think when we, and I understand the term, I understand the terminology of vicarious trauma. I'm like, but it almost seems like just the word vicarious makes it a step removed. And so to me, trauma is trauma. And I want them to understand, you know, that I know what vicarious trauma is, but I want them to know going in, it doesn't mean it affects you less.
No,
it doesn't mean that, and not that that's what you were saying at all, but when I'm talking to, you know, advocates going through it, I'm like, hey, trauma is trauma.
That's right.
Vicarious just means that's how we're exposed to it, right?
You can't be a little bit pregnant, you know, when you've got trauma. And, you know, one of the phrases is that, you know, the issue is in the tissue, that those traumatic issues, they permeate our body. They're in our presence, both in our physical body, in our spiritual body, and in our mental body. And no, that's I couldn't agree with you more, Rachel.
Rachel, one of the things that we love to talk about is, you know, the strategies to de-stress at the end of the day. And, you know, you mentioned having a martini, one, not 20. What other strategies have you found are helpful? Whether it's hanging out with your lovely family or who I know, I mean, you've got a wonderful support system. Is it gardening, walking the dog, making dinner? What are some of the strategies that you found to be helpful after a particularly emotional day in court?
So I have found that the concept of embracing your present really makes a difference. I love lots of things. You know, I love to go boating and biking and being at the beach and being with the kids and being with the husband-like creature, you know, and everybody else. I mean, I really do believe you take the best in that. You know, I mean, I grow herbs in my backyard because I love just going outside and knowing that I can grab that from my backyard, even though I'm terrible at it. You know, every year, Brett makes fun. He's like, oh, you're going to kill some more plants? Yes, I am. I am going to kill some more. But you know what? I have hope. I have hope. And I have you know, where there's a will, there's a way. But I really do believe, I mean, embracing whatever matters to you. Embracing the good. We all have so much good in our life that until something really traumatic happens to us, we sometimes we miss it, right? We want it to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, then we don't, you know, we're always concerned that it's, you know, oh, but it's not like this. I think we wait a lot of our lives to start living. You know, I'll start when I get a house, or I'll do this when I get married, or I'll do this it's now. You know, and I'm a carpe diem kind of person, a carpe diem kind of person that thinks there's trauma around every corner. I'm very cautious, even though I love to do everything so people will laugh. But I also believe in, and this is why we started our nonprofit, I really do believe in physical fitness with a community. I find that being able to focus inward a little bit in not just your physical fitness, but your mental wellness, and to do so with people who understand you, understand what you've got going on, understanding your trauma. I think that's a really important way to cope with anything, because it gives you something concrete to do, not just to think about, but to do. And, that's why we kind of looked at some of the things that we were doing and wanted to say, hey, we want to give our trauma and abuse victims and our first responders and military, because they're also trauma and abuse victims, but these are two very different communities. And we wanted to give them something where, hey, we want to help you feel better about yourself by feeling good about, being in shape, being healthier. I have a good friend who is 48 years old who just died from a heart attack on duty. And, is my husband's best friend. And that was one of the impetus for saying, hey, can we be healthier? He was getting healthier, but didn't realize that, he had heart issues and some other things that were going on. So like, how can we support that? So we're looking at physical fitness, looking at help people get healthier. And for our trauma and abuse group, our survivors of abuse, we want them to know, hey, you're not crazy. You're not crazy. You're feeling this way for a reason, right? It's okay not to be okay. These are normal reactions to abnormal situations. Here's your community. And that was born out of, we had 3 survivors come to a physical fitness event. They were raising money for domestic violence, and they spoke, and they'd never spoken before. And they said, wow, this was great. It was so great to be around people who got it. And this is fun. And hey, I want to join your gym, and I want to do this. I want to do this more often. It was like, hey, wait a minute. They love this. They want to do this. They want something concrete. We can help them. Help me, help you. You help me. Feeling like we're doing something good. And then for our first responders too, getting them healthier, et cetera. So, I really do believe in the physical fitness capacity of it. There's so much you can focus in on, and being around people who get it, I think it's really important, because, you see that national debate going on, for the past, few years, and it's really traumatized. It's an extra layer of trauma for our first responders going through that when they've had that kind of a day, and then they come home to see, the news, or maybe a family member who wants to argue about something that, they've never experienced or done. And sometimes you need to kind of hang out with people who have also seen some of the things that you've seen, or experienced some of the abuse that you experienced, so you feel a little normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we were discussing this with a previous guest this week, was the fact that, if you look at some of the studies that were done after the World Trade Center, Boscarini did a study where they looked at first responders that were extremely traumatized, those that were seeking their support through mental health professionals versus those that were getting that support and help from their peers. And what that study showed was that the individuals that were getting the help from their peers, that impact was so much greater than mental health professionals. So absolutely, when you have that ability to be with a peer that understands the nature of the trauma that you've been exposed to, that can be extremely, extremely helpful. Your passion is so amazing. I would love to say you're the rule, but you have that understanding of stress and trauma. You're very passionate about fighting that. So many people in these occupations do not. But looking back to say, before you came to this epiphany of an understanding of how stress and trauma affects you and how to prevent it, looking back, was this something that your colleagues talked about? And we're talking about the stress and trauma actually in the courtroom. Was that something, do you recall your colleagues or yourself talking about it?
So I would say there are certainly some colleagues I did speak about with, and they spoke about it, and we spoke about it freely. And I wouldn't say we spoke about it much at work, because I do believe a lot of the times when you're at work, that pause button is on. As you said, I thought that was a great way to explain it, that you have to put the pause button on, because otherwise you're not effective. If you can't put the pause button on, that's when you need to take a break. That's when you need to actually not be at work, probably, because we have to set that pause button at least while we're in the thick of it, so that we can get work done, and so that we can be there for the victims and be there for the people who are counting on us. I would say that I had, colleagues who were not so gracious about trauma. I remember we had one officer who had witnessed something extremely horrible, but I don't think many of the colleagues knew exactly what had happened. And so they were standing around talking about, well, if he can't handle this, then he can't handle the job, and going on and on. And I just remember, a couple of us broke in and said, hey, did you know that this is actually what happened? And once they heard that, they were very empathetic, and they were very much concerned. They were very like, oh, and we were saying, hey, but for the grace of God, that could have been you, and you would have been the one going through all that and feeling all that stuff today. And when they knew the reality, they embraced what he was going through. They understood what was happening. But our field tends to be very gossipy and tongue-in-cheek, and sometimes we don't want to know the reality because might be too much for us. So it's just easier to pretend that we can handle it, but others can't. That's why we're okay. I'm okay. It's fine. You might not be, but I'm okay. Right? So some people definitely were able to talk about it and some weren't. And I think, you asked the question earlier, was it easier later? I think it was easier later because even though it had built up, you recognized it was okay to talk about that. I think when you're new, you don't really get that because you don't want to be that guy or that gal. And I can say, as a female in law enforcement, I didn't want to be that gal for sure. Yeah, because when you make a mistake as a female in law enforcement, it's all women in law enforcement are now verboten. Versus if you're a male in law enforcement, you make a mistake, you're just that guy. But for us, it's like, that's why girls don't belong. So.
Younger officers, they are very vulnerable. They're very impressionable. They're discovering who they are. And right. Sort of the person they were before law enforcement combined with the person that they're becoming as they begin this career will kind of merge together, and there'll be a metamorphosis. But many times during that period of time, those officers, they haven't found their psychological body armor, that sort of right. level of protection that we're aware. And, when we realize there are signals of distress, either that they're mental or that they're physical or they're emotional, that's a warning sign that says, hey, you know what, like the check engine light in the car, something needs some attention, and it really needs to be dealt with. Doesn't mean that it's really major. It could be minor, but if you don't deal with it, it could become something that is quite catastrophic. It's very important that people have that sense of awareness, certainly that you have.
Well, and I think, that's actually a really good point, how the younger officers, they are they're changing into who they're going to become, because if this job doesn't change you, then you're probably not doing it right, because you're just not out there enough. And that's not necessarily a bad thing that it changes you, just that it's the reality. I don't think you can see and go through the level of trauma and the level of experiences that an average officer will go through without changing. And if you're not open and with your spouse, let's say you're married prior to becoming an officer, I think that's why we have a lot of divorces, because that change occurs when I was married before and now I'm changing into this new person. That's why I recommend all the time the Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Dr. I think it's Gil Martin, is great, because there's so many concepts in there that once the family reads the components in it, and once the officer reads the components in it, and you realize, hey, when I come home at the end of a really terrible day and I don't want to hear about the neighbor's barking dog, because that doesn't equal the homicide victim I saw or the terrible crash, like I just don't care about that right now. And then understanding, that you have to, readjust into the family role, and not be the person at work that you are at home, but to not separate the two so much that they become completely different places, because now you're a person here and then you're a person here, and that's not great for a marriage either. So there's that, and that's part of a negative coping mechanism, or the affairs, and all these other things that happen that are so common among law enforcement.
Rachel, specifically with respect to the courtroom trauma that we've discussed, what kind of advice or education were you given when you were a law enforcement officer as to how you cope with that?
So I think we talk a good game again about trauma. We talk about trauma. We talk about, hey, you have EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, and hey, you have, for us, it's the counseling team, who are great. And hey, you have the opportunity to go to any psychology folks or whatever. But we don't really have, other than what's mandated, in the academy, to talk about trauma and courtroom trauma, et cetera. Which honestly, it was so impressionable, I cannot remember if we even had it. I don't remember if we even got any. There isn't really a lot of discussion about that. I think it's gotten better over the years, but it's still not normalized. It's not, it's more of, hey, you going to court today? That's it. I mean, it's not really, there's not a big discussion about this large case. I mean, we've had some very significant cases in our jurisdiction that would cause people from across the United States to have trauma watching it in a courtroom. The Turpin case, for example, was one of them. And there's just not a lot about that. Even the folks that are our EAP people, they're all very nice people. But I remember, at least at our station, our employee assistance folks, number one, you were afraid that if you said anything that was too traumatic, that they would go tell a supervisor, right? And then number two, it was non-sworn very often, who, God bless them, I'm grateful for them and they're wonderful and they're out there with us every day, but they may not know exactly what it's like to shoot somebody and take someone's life, which is, I can't even begin to express, what that kind of trauma.
Or even have an understanding of the subculture to which these people, and that's such a problem right now when it comes to the dealing with the mental impact of law enforcement. I mean, there can be, mental health practitioners, very well known, they may have a TV show, they may have a book that documents how great they are. But, the focus of their education, the focus of their practice may have been, relationships and family, not trauma, not traumatic stress, and certainly not the subculture to which individuals who work in law enforcement operate in. And those, you can't apply typical civilian principles to stress and trauma to first responders because they don't respond the same way. They're still human beings, but there's a different angle and a different walk that has to be taken to really be effective in making a difference like that. And what you said about post, so I'm a post instructor. I've been, for years knocking on the doors of the police academy, specifically in incorporating critical incident stress management, critical incident stress briefing to basic academies. The number one cause of death of a police officer in North America is suicide. It's double all of the other line of duty deaths. So is it not logical that when we are training our young officers at the academy, that we give them adequate training to defend themselves against what the number one cause of death is? And many times what happens is, okay, we've freed up the schedule, you've got an hour. You need more than an hour to train a person to defend themselves against what their number one sort of cause of death is in that profession. So absolutely, bringing a sense of awareness and a responsibility, both at an academy level, at a government level, and certainly with post, is extremely, extremely important. I'm sure that there must have been times when you observed colleagues that maybe weren't managing the stress and trauma as well as you were. How did that make you feel?
And then there were times I didn't handle it well. I certainly don't want to pretend that I was always, rainbows, unicorns, and lollipops when it came to that. But there were times when and it was usually people that will bury it deep down. There's only so much that you're going to be able to do. And I think that's where, in terms of at that moment, the more you press certain people, if they're ones that like to bury it deep down, you're just going to get a bigger and bigger and bigger wall. So this is where I think it's really important, like you said, in terms of post, in terms of providing all that information, in terms of giving them, arming them with information they're going to be able to take. We have to normalize this and make it an everyday, inherent in what we do. You see all these movies all the time, right? Lethal Weapon. They joke about the police psychologist that's in the building. I've never had a police psychologist in our building, or a counselor, or anyone who understood trauma, who was there every day, who you could sit and talk to and maybe walk into their office. We don't have that. I'm sure there's some agencies that do, but the smaller agencies across the United States, ours is a very large agency, we don't have that, the one I used to work at. And we really do have to, we don't have posters up that say, hey, and I know that New York Police Department does, because when I was there, I saw them in all their different places, but how much do they normalize the trauma that everyone experiences? Have we made it okay to say, hey, today sucked? I know that's not, the best, most intelligent and scholarly way to put it. But that's what someone wants at the end of the day. They want to be able to say, you know what, not for nothing, but this day was terrible. My heart hurts. Like, what happened today was not okay. And maybe your heart hurts because your job isn't what you wanted it to be, or maybe you had a bad experience with your supervisor that was traumatic, or maybe when you were in court today, you didn't read your report as well as you could, and maybe you feel like, because you were exhausted, because you were on the 12th hour shift, and you went into court and you thought you were prepared, but then you got asked all these questions, and now you're concerned that a suspect whom you're pretty dang sure is guilty because you have a ton of evidence might get off because your courtroom presentation was terrible. And now you're feeling guilty, and now you're feeling terrible. Maybe the victim came up to you afterwards and yelled and cursed at you because they couldn't believe you said this or said that. I myself had, we just did a presentation, actually, I think Wendy knows this, for End Violence Against Women International, with one of the victims that I worked with. And the trauma was that after our case was over and after it was adjudicated, the district attorney asked her if she wanted to watch the video interview with the suspect. I never knew that our victims had that option. And when I interview someone, it is a Howard Stern Oprah conversation. That's how you get people to tell you more information. You're not yelling at them, you're empathizing, you're connecting, you're engaging, you're having a conversation, you're getting, 6 times, I had someone say no to no, not talking for Miranda. And, that's because we have those conversations. But if you're a victim seeing that, now I'm commiserating with your suspect. Now I'm telling them I understand. Now I'm saying, oh, there must be something else here. That was when she let me know that. My advocate told me about it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found out. I looked back on several of the other victims. I was like, I didn't know we were doing that. I would have liked the opportunity to have discussed that with them so they could have saved themselves the trauma of seeing that. That to me was trauma in the courtroom, because I didn't know that was happening. I feel like I wrapped this case up with a bow, if you will. This person got prison time. We got everything we wanted out of it, but now the victim's upset. Now the victim's crying. Now the victim's hurt. Now the victim feels traumatized, and they feel like that I, betrayed them. And that for me was extremely traumatizing for a while until I was able to kind of reconcile. And that's our presentation. What we talked about was talking about those moments.
When you're in your role of working in the courtroom in that position, what resources were you told where they said, Rachel, listen, stress and trauma in the courtroom, these are the resources that are available for you to help deal with them?
In the courtroom? Yeah, so what had happened was, the victim advocates are there and they do a phenomenal job. I would say that's the best resource in our courtroom. I don't think it ever came from the Sheriff's Department, no fault to the Sheriff's Department, but I just don't think that that's where their head's at. Their head is more at, a traumatic incident out in the field versus what you're seeing in the courtroom. Because most of the time we've seen what's going to be shown in the courtroom, not always, but most of the time we're the ones bringing it there. So we've experienced it already. At that point, I think the trauma comes from, God bless the public defenders, and I'm glad they're there, and I'm glad the defense attorney's there. We have to have an even, system of justice. But when you hear someone ripping apart the victim that's up on the stand, or you have someone ripping apart your hard work, that's really difficult. And then if, God forbid, they bring up something you didn't do that you didn't realize, like, oh shoot, how did we miss that? Then that's another level of trauma. But going to the component, we didn't really talk about that in our department, but I would say the victim advocates from the DA's office that are present, at least in criminal, are phenomenal. If you're talking any of the civil courtrooms or anything like that, no, we're not talking about trauma. The judges aren't talking about trauma, certainly, because they've got their hands full doing other things. Everybody in there is just a cog in a wheel, essentially. And it's not until that time is over that we're experiencing what we're left with.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rachel. That was a very lively, engaging, both entertaining and informative interview, just as we knew it would be. Thank you so much for gracing us with a little bit of your time. I know how busy you are.
Well, thank you guys for putting up with my schedule today. I'm in a case, and I'm perhaps a little, a little bit here, a little bit there.
No, it was
Thank you very much. It was absolutely my pleasure. And it was, I found your insights, both of you, extremely interesting. And I'm going to take them forward for our programs that we're working on. Thank you.